Today's topic is actually the science of storytelling with sort of a focus on media training towards the end, but we wanted to broaden it out just to the science of storytelling. And, just start off with this great quote that I love, that those who tell stories rule the world. And when you think about it, it's really true, right? You tend to gravitate towards the storytellers in your world. And our favorite stories and our best memories are really around those stories and the storytellers in our lives, and that's what we remember. So on today's agenda, we talked a little bit about it. We're going to just discuss how to identify a great story and sort of learn about what makes a great story so that we can incorporate it into your worlds. We're going to talk about the power of storytelling to engage and inform new audiences, like media, like the public, or potentially even donors and funders. And then we're going to talk about some tips to tell your story to media, and first starting off with how to know if your story is something that media would be interested in, and what are the next steps in terms of contacting public affairs, and how we can help you sort of discover that. And then once the media interview is confirmed, how we can help you and guide you in terms of the preparation for that. So we're going to begin today with something called the narrative arc. And this is really basically a formula that is used to tell a great story. You start off with something called the exposition, and that's really the setting the scene and meeting the characters. In a great story, there's always a hero, somebody who's on a quest to achieve a goal of some kind. There's always twists and turns and always challenges and obstacles in the way. And as the tension rises, about 3/4 of the way through a great story, there's a climax or a payoff. After that, there's still a great part of the story or the movie left, and that's really just the resolution of that quest and that goal, and then the new normal, basically. And this is a story formula that probably sounds familiar because it's basically the plot of every Hollywood movie ever. As you can see here on the right, a few blockbuster Hollywood movies, and it's all coming together for you now because you're like, aha, yeah, of course, the hero, the quest, the rising tension. So let's talk a little bit about what makes a great story. We talked about the narrative arc and sort of the formula that you follow to make a great story. But on the right here, you have a photo from one of my favorite movies ever, The Princess Bride. I have seen this movie probably 100 times. Every time I see it, I feel the same way. I'm excited. I can't wait to see what's going to happen. I'm very invested with the characters, even though, of course, I know what's going to happen in the movie. So what makes a great story, and particularly why do movies resonate with us? They're compelling. The storyline is always something that is very compelling to us. There's meaning. It has a deep meaning to us, and it really resonates in that way as well. Great stories are relatable. Now, in this case, I can't really relate to, the princess or royalty, but I can relate to her story. I can relate to the power of true love, and I can relate to some of her values as a character, that she's brave and determined, and she's not going to give up. And so these are all things that ultimately bring us to a connection. And that's really the most important thing when it comes to storytelling, is making that connection with people, because that's when they're going to remember what you're talking about and why it's important. Great stories transport us into another world. They capture and hold our attention. And most importantly, they have the ability to change our behavior. And when it comes to storytelling, this is really what it's all about. Especially in science, that's why storytelling can be transformative. Here's a great quote that I came across from Andrew Revkin. He's a quite well-known environmental journalist, and he worked for the New York Times .earth blog for many, many years. He's now with Columbia University. Science is full of questions, conflict, dead ends, insights, and the occasional thrilling leap. And as such, is a story well told. So I don't have to tell many of you this, but in addition to how stories can move us to tears and change our attitudes and even inspire us, storytelling, as it turns out, is actually pretty good for our brains. And there's several studies that have shown us this. So, for example, there's dopamine, the feel-good chemical. And this is basically, tied to our emotions. Dopamine is what helps us remember an event, what keeps us engaged in the event, and also helps us remember the feeling that we're feeling. And then there's cortisol, which is kind of like our early warning system. for danger, but it also just keeps us alert and helps us to formulate and retain those memories. Oops. And then oxytocin, of course, back in 2004, neuroscientist Paul Zak discovered that oxytocin has the ability to make us feel a certain trustworthiness, not only with actual people, but also with people that we just think that we know, or people that we just think that we feel close to. And that's why when we're talking about movies and characters, why those characters sometimes really resonate with us. In the context of science and storytelling, it's also what just helps us feel a connection to that person, to that scientist. So the stories that you tell as scientists, they may not necessarily give you goosebumps or give people goosebumps, make people's heart race, but they're important just the same because they can be much more impactful than data alone. So easier said than done. Let's call out the elephant in the room. People who are scientists or people who work in science are not often trained as storytellers. And oftentimes it's really the antithesis of what you think you should be doing. So here are a few statements that I've put together just from conversations that I've had with people over the last couple of years working at Krembil, and also some articles that I was reading about science communication. And tell me, I'm curious whether they resonate with you. Scientists look for truth, not an end result. Creating a narrative will compromise objectivity. A scientist's job is to inform, not to persuade. And of course, my personal favorite, scientists are not wired to be storytellers. So I highly disagree. And I think also we have to really make the distinction between a story that's made up and a story that's real, the story of you and who you are and what you do and why you do it. Most importantly, the fact is that the public needs stories to help them understand the impact of complex science. Otherwise, you're just missing a great opportunity to be able to impart what you know and why it's important to people. And most importantly, you're going to miss an opportunity to get them on side to support science and to support your work. So a couple of quick facts and statistics for you based on a couple of surveys that are listed below. 80% of Canadians say they know little to nothing about science. 32% say that they're skeptical about science. But the great news is that 41% are fascinated by scientific breakthroughs, but they just wish that they understood them better. 52% say scientists need to do a better job of making scientific information understandable to the average person. That's why we're here today. We want to help you help people in the public and media, etc., have a better understanding of the science that's happening, especially at UHN and especially at Krembil, and really just help people understand the impact of that and why it's so important. Another great quote, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. And this is Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist and economist, and the winner of the 2002 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. I've got a couple of pro tips for you in this presentation, and these are just basically extra little bits of added information. There's a site called Story Collider, and it's actually a story project with lots of different platforms, and it's really worth checking out. Story Collider is basically by scientists and people working in science for scientists and people working in science, and it's a great place to go to see how scientists around the world are sharing those stories. There's podcast shows, workshops, so you can just go to storycollider.org, and it'll be in my resources as well that we'll send out after today's talk. But I think it's a really great place to start for you to get a feel for what some of your colleagues internationally are doing. We're just going to go through a few quick ways of telling your story effectively on different platforms. So I pulled up this tweet here because I thought it was a great example of what often happens on social media in the science realm. You know, there's a lot of tweets that go out to congratulate people on accomplishments, a lot of tweets that go out about retirements and other milestones that have happened for people. And I feel like there's a real opportunity being missed to tell a story. So we could have very easily put out a tweet that just shared the information that Dr. Davis is going to be retiring at the end of the month and a little bit of information about what she has accomplished at Krembil. But I really wanted to take the opportunity to tell a bit of a story. And I think this is a real easy hit for many of us, especially as you're getting more familiar with social media. Maybe you're very comfortable with social media. Never miss an opportunity to tell a story. So, world-renowned scientist, trusted colleague, mentor. I had friend in there, but it was too many characters, so I had to take it out. Dr. Aileen Davis is retiring from Krembil after 15 years leading a research program to help those living with musculoskeletal diseases such as osteoarthritis improve their quality of life. Join us in wishing her well. Again, just to never miss an opportunity to tell a story wherever you can. Here's an interesting infographic. It's from the Ted Rogers Center. I just thought it was a great example. And obviously Twain knows a lot more about this than I do, and he had a whole session a couple of weeks ago, but it's an infographic is something to definitely consider when you're storytelling and you want to impart information in a compelling, engaging way and really capture people's attention. So what I liked about this one is that it's very much about, here's the problem, here's what we're doing about it, here's the impact, here's what happens if we're successful. And that's the storyline here for me. We talk about photography and storytelling. And again, we had a session last week all about photography. We've got another one coming up about photographing portraits. Storytelling is all about the visual, and photography is such an important part of that. So if you look here, you'll notice that each of these photos really tells a story about that person, who they are, what's their quest. It elicits some emotion from us, even if that emotion is just curiosity to learn more. So it's really important, I think, to be able to consider the photography that you're using, whether it's a tweet that you're putting it out, whether it's a headshot that you're going to be sharing for an upcoming conference, whatever the platform is that you're going to be using it for, or that you're going to be telling your story, photography, especially in a presentation or a slide deck, is really such an effective way of getting people's attention and of appealing to a lay audience. They really resonate with photos. So it's just something to consider whenever you have the opportunity to use a visual or an infographic, or most importantly, a photo instead of a chart or a graph. It's probably a good idea. And lastly, we're just going to talk about media for a second. So here's a couple of stories that have appeared in media, a couple of Krembil stories. And I just want to take you back for just a second to the narrative arc that we learned about earlier on. So let's take the story on the left about Dr. Mojgan Hodai. She's the hero of the story. She is on a quest to help people who are living with this terribly painful syndrome. There's so many challenges and obstacles that come up when you deal with science, because you have to learn things that don't work often before you learn what does. The climax of this story is that despite all of those challenges, she's just performed her 1,000th procedure. And of course, the resolution of the story is that she's not going to stop until she finds out more about this disease and helps more patients. So I think it's a really great example of how to tell your story in 2 sentences. All of that basically comes out of that. So everything is in the context of hooking people in, letting them know a little bit about why it's important and engage them in that way. On the right, we've got a great story about ankylosing spondylitis. Dr. Inman and Dr. Haroon are the heroes of that story. And what's great about it is also the mystery, like on the left, talking about trigeminal neuralgia, the mystery of ankylosing spondylitis, that so many people suffer from back pain. Well, it might be this, this disorder, this back pain that you may not even, you've never heard of this term, but that might be what you have. So again, sometimes these headlines make people uncomfortable, but you do have to think about the hook of storytelling, drawing people in so that you can then give them all of that information. It's not easy to interest media. I know a lot of people, I get a lot of requests from people about wanting media attention, and it's never easy to be able to interest people. And so there's a checklist that I put together, and I'm going to share it with you now. And these are things that you really should think about. Your first step is always to touch base with public affairs. These are the questions that we are going to ask you. And these are the questions that media are interested in. And so it's important to think about them in advance. When you want media attention, think about answering these questions. What did you find? Why is it significant or unique? Is it a world first? Was it unexpected? How could these findings impact patient care? Most importantly, especially for television media, do you have visuals to share? Photos, video, even microscopy images are beautiful and often media is very excited to be able to use them. And then, is there a patient who's willing to be interviewed? Now, obviously, that's where public affairs comes in terms of consenting patients, but we will often go to doctors and scientists to find out which patients might be interested in helping us out. Another thing to think about is if you work in research and you don't deal directly with patients, occasionally there's a patient that we've interviewed in a past story This happened recently in a stroke case where there was stroke research coming out, and television media reporter was interested in doing the story, but they said, you know, is there a patient we could speak with? So we went and appealed to that patient that we have interviewed for a completely different story, just about the experience of living with stroke and recovering from stroke. And then that person was part of that story. So again, just a checklist for you to consider when you're going through whether or not your story or your latest research paper is something that might appeal to media. Here's a few tips once you've secured that media interview and the CBC reporter is coming tomorrow at 3 to interview you. These are some things to really start working on right away. And again, this is where public affairs can come in handy. And this is really what we do, is we work with you to make sure that your key points are crafted. Really important to have 3 or 4 key points from your research that you want to make sure get across. And it's also really important to try to stop there. It's so difficult when you're trying to give context to everything that you're talking about, not to give too much information and to talk to that reporter for 20 or 30 minutes. But the truth is you make it more difficult for them to understand what is the story about and what is it supposed to be about. So that's why I often get this reaction from people that I have media requests about. They might say, I don't do media, or media always get it wrong. And the truth is that it's a two-way street. If you give somebody too much information and they have such a short time to be able to tell that story, it's kind of on both of us to be able to make them understand exactly what is the most important. A general assignment reporter might be covering politics on Monday. They might be covering a raccoon infestation on Tuesday, and then a scientific breakthrough on Wednesday. They may have a minute and a half or 2 minutes to tell this story. So you need to really pare down exactly what is important, what you want to make sure gets into the story, and stick to that as much as possible. Definitely you want to do a run through, and again, this is where public affairs can come in handy. When the camera turns on, or when the microphone turns on, you want to take a deep breath or 2, just to relax yourself, because it's very nerve-wracking to have a microphone either in your face or to hear it click on over the phone. Really important to repeat the question in the answer. And what I mean by that is, let's say a reporter asks you, so tell me, what did you find in this study? And you want to answer with, in this study, we found that. Or they may say to you, how long have you been working on this research? And you want to answer by saying, our lab's been working on this research for almost 20 years now. So it's a little trick, but it comes in so handy in that almost everything you say is a soundbite or a clip that they can use in their story, if it's a full clip like that. You also, as we talked about before, want to keep answers very short and succinct as much as possible, because otherwise they will cut out the parts that they need and the context that you're trying to share may or may not get in there. So these are all things that we learn along the way. I think it's really important to consider, media is our ally in helping us get our research and our science out there. And we just have to work with them in the best way possible to do that. Another quick pro tip to share, simplify the science. Here's a couple of examples for you, and there are many, many examples of words and terms that are used sometimes in these media interviews that you assume a lay audience will understand, and you just can't assume that that's the case. So for example, biomarkers. Here's a word that we all use pretty much every day. But when you say it in the context like this, a biomarker is something in the body that we use to identify early stage disease or abnormalities. For example, body temperature might be considered a well-known biomarker for fever. Very, very simple, easy explanation. What I'm trying to get across is just that you have to give people that extra added explanation to help give them an analogy or give them something that they can relate to understand what it is. Toxicity. We're measuring the toxicity levels or the potential side effects of the drug. Or pathogenesis, that's one that comes up a lot in media interviews that I've noticed. So along the lines of, our lab is studying the pathogenesis of Parkinson's disease. So how the disease originates and develops. So it doesn't always have to be a full explanation. It could just be another line that just gives more context or understanding to that person, so they don't have to go back and say, sorry, what does that mean? A couple other quick tips when it comes to words to use. Oftentimes, it's not about dumbing it down, it's really about simplifying it. So oftentimes you might use words like accomplish or perform instead of do, or commence or initiate instead of begin, or even quantify. And you might want to use a word like measure. So there's really a glossary to consider, and all of this comes from practicing. So if you do a run through or two, especially with somebody in public affairs, we will help you come up with the proper terminology, because many of us are former journalists and all of us are pretty much a lay audience. So it's kind of a perfect storm of help for you when you're preparing for these interviews. Okay, I'm going to take you back to the Public Affairs Toolkit as well in my trusty laser pointer. When you go onto the corporate internet, you've got something on the left here called the Public Affairs Toolkit, and it'll take you to this page here. Under Policies and Guidelines, it would be a really good idea to click on the Media Relations tab here. There's some really interesting guidelines about what it means to speak with media, what are some of the UHN guidelines, especially around patient information and patient care and what you need to consider. Down here under News and Media Resources is a whole worksheet on working with the media and things to consider. So I think that it's really important if you've got an upcoming media interview that you want to check those out. And just to recap, we're talking about effective storytelling skills. So what can it do for you? Well, they can help you engage and inform the public, build trust, very important, promote your work, interest media, which we talked about, and most importantly, solicit support for science. Your challenge, if you choose to accept it, is to write your own story. This does not have to be a novella. In fact, it shouldn't be, based on everything that we're talking today about things being short and succinct. We're talking a paragraph or two, and it's really a great exercise that I'm happy to help you with, but also it's a great exercise for you to understand more about your own story. And you really have to think about, what is your headline? What do you hope to accomplish? What motivates you in this world? Which obstacles have you faced, and how have you persevered through those? Why should people care about your work? Think about it in that context, and it's really going to be interesting what you come up with. And most importantly, how does it change the world or improve lives? Storytelling has the power to engage and influence and inspire and change behavior, like we talked about. And there's an art to telling a good story, but there's also a science to it, which is what we've talked about today. So if there's one thing that you take away from today's talk, I hope it's that you need to establish this connection with your audience, no matter who your audience is, in order to help them understand why it's important for them to know about your work and why it's important for them to support science. That's it. So I'm wondering if we have any questions or if anybody has any suggestions or feedback. I think we're going to put that Slido slide back up, Carly, if we're able to, just so people can mark that down for next week's session, which is the Wildcard Q&A. And I'll also just give you a couple of suggestions. When we talk about a Wildcard Q&A, you know, Twain is the one to talk to about a lot of the visual stuff, about photography, about infographics, if you have specific questions. You can ask me about communicating science, about media training tips. Maybe you have a paper coming up and you're not really sure, you know, what the next steps are in terms of getting media attention or how to go about that. So those are the kinds of questions that we're looking to for next week to help you with. It's a bit of an experiment. So do we have any questions?
Great. Well, I just want to thank Heather so much for today's session. I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now. So maybe while some of those questions are being formulated and typed out, maybe we can go to our weekly draw with Amy and Ellie for our Krembil mug. So we do this each and every week for those that have come and participated in our session, and it's just a nice little giveaway. Amy, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, all right, so welcome everybody. Just give me a second here. So here we go. Please excuse my daughter who has remained in pajamas today. But it's Friday, so all right. So here we go. Here are all the names of everybody who has joined us today. Ellie's going to pull out one name for us. She's going to try to read it with her limited reading skills. And what does this say? If you can't read it, maybe we should, I don't know if this is somebody's nickname on their Zoom account. It's Stobe, S-T-O-B-E.
Oh, it's Dr. Taub, Sheldon
Dr.
Taub.
Oh, are you there, Dr. Taub?
I think that's how you pronounce it. I apologize if it's not. Yep, he's here.
Yep.
He wins a Krembil mug.
Wow. Thank you.
That. That's pretty
Your daughter
exciting.
for me, Amy.
Congratulations.
Absolutely, that's great. I'm just going to go back into the chat now. Once again, congratulations. Michael has a comment here. We have a lot of thank yous, so that's great, Heather. His remark, he says that for sure in today's time, we scientists need to reach out and tell people about scientific facts and reality. We need to become really good at this.
Yes, I agree. As you obviously know from my presentation, I'll just be very honest. I come from a media background. It's where I spent the majority of my career, and it almost feels like being on the other side of a fence, where I feel like I understand exactly the kind of stories that media are looking for. And I think that, you know, the truth is that what people don't realize is that reporters and producers, they're looking for great stories. Everybody is looking for great stories all the time. And there are hours of airtime to fill and many columns of newspapers and websites to fill. So the appetite is always there. I think people really look at things and think how hard it is to get media interested in a story. And it is hard. I mean, it really has to be a good story to interest media. But there is so much appetite out there for interesting research and interesting science. I think the biggest thing to think about, in addition to sort of the mind shift that comes with teaching yourself a different way of communicating, which is really what this is all about. When you're a scientist, you're not taught to be a narrative storyteller. It's really like an extra added skill that you have to pick up. But it's really so important. And once you learn how to do it, it becomes second nature to you. And there's also this dichotomy between feeling like you're dumbing things down versus simplifying. I think a lot of people who work in science, they really feel like they're speaking, you know, they're really dumbing it down if they're going to use plain language, or they're really dumbing it down if, you know, they have to cut, they can't give the context of their 3 previous papers to explain this paper. But like I mentioned, I mean, a lot of reporters are general assignment reporters. They're not health or science reporters. And even if they are, they're covering such a wide swath of subject matter. You have to help them. And it's in helping them, in helping yourself, it helps them. So every time that we have a big media interview coming up, if I'm asked for help, and it has to go through public affairs anyway, but if I'm working with the scientist or the doctor, we're coming up with those key points. We're doing a run through or 2 or 3 until we sort of hone it down to something that is manageable and something that we know will interest the reporter. And also, in a 1.5-minute story that's going to appear on CBC, unless it's a national piece that might be 5 or 6 minutes long, you may get 1 or 2 clips. That's 8 to 10 second sentences that you may get in. So you have to also, I don't want to say lower your expectations, but you have to understand what's being asked of you as well. And if you're going to go into it and have a 45-minute conversation, that reporter, when they get back and they have to turn around that story for that night, they're just going to scroll through quickly and pick out something that sounds good in order to be able to tell the story. I have never met a reporter or a journalist that didn't always want to get the story right. So I think there's sometimes that fallacy as well, is that people think, well, they just don't care and they're just throwing it together because they're in such a hurry. Not true. Nobody wants to go on air or write something on a website or in a paper that isn't true, and also, you know, the context that you're looking for. So all things just to keep in mind that it's a process and it's a learning curve, and that's something that scientists do really well, learning. So I think it should be part of your process to become a storyteller as well. There, I just rambled. I just did the opposite of what I told you to do.
That's great. We've actually received several more either questions or comments. I'm going to go to Mary Pat next, who says that her experience is typically letting go of the hedging to the story so that we don't oversell.
Yes, this comes up repeatedly, is that a lot of people who work in science feel that they are being urged to oversell something. And I think what that comes down to is that you're always being, the word cure comes up, or, what is the end stage impact of your research? And people who work in science who may not realize that impact or that climax of their story for another 30 or 40 years, if ever, it's really uncomfortable to go there and say what we're working on might one day help patients with Parkinson's with their mobility. So we talked a little bit about this in a previous session, but it's really a balancing act. You have to be comfortable with the information that you're imparting. And at the same time, a reporter's never going to be interested in doing the story unless there's some impact for people. And that goes back to that checklist that we were talking about. So what does this mean for patients? It could be, what does this mean for them in 30 or 40 years? But the point is, why are you doing this? So I understand, Mary Pat, where that's coming from. I think that's always going to be an internal struggle for people who work in science, is to get to that point where you can speak very broadly about the long-term impact of your science without feeling like you are selling yourself out, or that you're uncomfortable in front of your colleagues because you're talking about something that isn't in any way remotely imminent. I hope that answers your question, but this comes up a lot, and I think that's probably why. It's just this uncomfortable situation that we just have to find a balance to.
Great, thank you, Heather.
Yes, thank you very much, Heather. I got to run to another thing, but very much appreciated the story.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So I have a question from Margaret. It says, thank you. And do you see opportunity to transfer some of these skills in communicating virtually with patients? We have a follow-up from Heidi as well that says, good point, definitely transferable skills to communicate with patients and their family.
Yes, excellent point. Patients, when we talk about, lay audiences, like people in the community or donors or media, we didn't talk specifically about patients, but that is a huge part of what we're talking about. Patients, more than anyone, are the people that you have to communicate to in a compelling, engaging way so that they understand. This goes specifically to clinical versus research potentially, but they have to understand what is going on in a lay way. I think that using analogies with patients is always something that's appreciated, and patients, I'm sure, want you to be very straight with them and give them very effective information. They want to know what's going on, but they need to understand it. And so I think that's probably, that's an issue that comes up often, is this communication between doctors and patients. And what patients need from you is direct information and communication. They don't need storytelling in the traditional format, but they do need analogies. They do need to understand within their circumstances and their context what's happening, and in terms of their treatment and that sort of thing. I hope that helps. I think I would put patients atop of community.
We have, there's a word that you've been using throughout your presentation, and actually just in your answer there, and Marina has asked, do you think that the use of the term lay language is appropriate?
It's a good point. It is a term that we use a lot in communications and in public affairs. Another term that comes up quite a lot that is probably more appropriate is plain language. I know that's something that is a bit more formal. So it's a great point, is whether we should use that term or stick to something like plain language. I think plain language is also something that more people understand. When you talk about using plain language, it makes more sense. So really good point. I'd be curious to hear what everybody else thinks about that.
I'm going to head over to our mug winner for today, and Dr. Taub has asked, what are your thoughts about controversy? Media often seems to want to put our stories into some form of controversy. What is your advice about this?
Very good point. I think that there's two kinds of stories. I mean, oftentimes, especially in research, if a reporter is coming to do an interview with a researcher, it's based on a paper that's come out. There are news stories that break, and they need to be handled more carefully. So especially if there's a controversy involved, that's something that's got to go through public affairs, and there's a whole process, and we sort of take it up the ladder to understand what is our commentary, what is our, what is we have to tell people what's going on and we have to tell them the truth, but we have a process for how we do that. Oftentimes controversy might include patient-related information, and we have very strict policies, especially at UHN, when it comes to patients in terms of identifying anything about them or their stories. So it's a tough question to ask because it's very situational, and it would have to be something that's more official. So for example, if you ever get a call from a CTV reporter or a Globe and Mail reporter asking you for comment on a very controversial topic, you would refer them to public affairs, because that's something that's been discussed. And again, we've got to answer the questions, but we've got to do it in a way that we're comfortable with, that goes by all of our guidelines.
Great, thank you. I hope I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but we have Premia, who is a clinical breast radiologist, an educator at UHN, who wanted to indicate that they always try and teach the importance of storytelling while writing reports, as well as while talking to patients, and so it was very important. And then there's just a comment that says this session was very useful.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, Carly, you cut out during part of that answer.
Oh, sorry.
So I wasn't, sorry, can you repeat it?
The comment was from a clinical breast radiologist and educator at UHN, and it says, I always try and teach the importance of storytelling while writing reports, as well as while talking with patients. And so this is very important, and the session was very useful.
Well, thank you very much. I think that it's a practice, and like any other practice or learning curve, you will get more and more used to it. Once you become a storyteller and once you pick up on this skill set, you will be storytelling in your grant applications. You will be storytelling in your communications with presentations and in your communications with patients. It will just become part of who you are. You will know that you need to hook people off the top in any kind of a talk that you're giving. You know that you then have to give them the information, and that if you put it in a personal light, or if you use analogies, that you'll just see people's faces light up more, and there will be more of a connection there. And it keeps coming back to that word connection. I'm going to talk more about this in a future session about crafting elevator pitches, but it's even as simple as thinking about you're talking to a group of donors and you have to introduce yourself, and you say, my name is Heather Sherman, and I study Parkinson's disease. In my lab we look at alpha-synuclein and this and that, and you give them a 30-second pitch about, this is who I am, this is what I do, everything is scientific. Or in the same amount of time, you say, you talk about the fact that your grandpa Bob was the light of your life, someone you were really close to as a child. You spent a lot of time together. One day he had trouble moving, and then you came to learn that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and it was at that moment that you decided to dedicate your life to this disease and to try to find, new treatments and help patients like your grandfather. Which story are you going to remember? And so when it comes to grant applications, that's a whole other thing. There's a lot of scientific information about how grants are often more successful when storytelling is used. And so I maintain that everyone wants to be entertained, even scientists. And I would really encourage you to try to incorporate storytelling into everything that you do. It just makes everything better.
It's an excellent point about the difference of those two introductions. I'll have to remember that. I'm just going to finish with one last comment before I hand it back to you, Heather, for closing remarks. So Dr. Taub has just said thanks, and he's always found that working with public affairs is critical and will not talk to the media without them working with me. So that's excellent. Well done. Okay, thank you so much. And Heather, please close us off for today.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Dr. Taub. I want to thank him for that comment, because I think that there is often a big disconnect between people understanding really what public affairs does. And, we are your advocates. We are your wingmen and women. And our goal is to help you get that promotion for your work. Our goal is to help you become science communicators, and to, everything within the context of helping you get where you want to be in terms of your communication skills, and also help you with promotion for your work. So I really appreciate that comment, because I find that there does seem to be a disconnect there, and that people should really understand that that's what we do and that's who we are, and that we are here to help you. And please do reach out to your public affairs representatives wherever you work within UHN, because it's an amazing team and really talented, incredible people who, again, are mostly former journalists, so have that insight into what makes a great story and how to pitch it. So I just want to thank everybody for coming today. I had a great time. I hope you did too. Love to talk about this kind of thing. Next week, we have our Wildcard QA, and you can see on the left side of your screen that there's a QR code. There's you can also go to Slido and put in 14832. Would love to hear from you. We're going to give it, I think, Carly, an hour next week, depending on how many questions we get. We want to be able to answer as many as possible. So the sooner you can get us the information and the questions in advance, we can prepare, and we're really looking forward to it. So happy Friday. Thanks for coming. Be well. Have a restful weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.